Hi everyone, I'm Jess Blankshane from the National Security Affairs Department at the Naval War College. Everything I'm about to say represents my own personal views, not those of my employer. Today we're going to introduce the organizational process perspective. This is intended to complement your assigned reading from Chapter 5 of the Decision Making in American Foreign Policy textbook. To start, we'll situate the organizational process perspective in our overall foreign policy analysis framework. As we discussed previously, this course will use a number of analytical perspectives to isolate key actors and behaviors that help us understand foreign policy decision-making. Today, we're going to look at the organizational process perspective, which focuses on governmental organizations making foreign policy decisions or making foreign policy by processing information and initiating action based on pre-existing procedures and organizational culture. This also means that we're moving to the state or societal level of analysis in our levels of analysis framework, looking at explanations of foreign policy decision-making that focus on the internal organizations and political cultures of a state. We'll start by talking about what it means to think of organizations as actors, and then we'll talk about what it means to view foreign policy as outputs of these organizations. So what does it mean to think of an organization as an actor? We know that organizations, like the Department of State or the Central Intelligence Agency, are made up of people. But just like when we talked about the unitary state perspective, we abstracted away from all the organizations and people that make up states. When we use the organizational process perspective, we're going to abstract away from the people who make up the organizations to look at organizations as actors in their own right. And in this view, organizations are defined by their mission, their structure, and their culture. A government organization's high-level mission or purpose is usually determined at its founding by Congress or the president or some combination, whoever created the organization. But it's often stated in broad terms, leaving plenty of room for interpretation of the mission and for changes over time. Morton Halperin created the term organizational essence to describe, quote, the view held by the dominant group within the organization of what its mission and capabilities should be, end quote. Essence is, in a sense, the organization's identity. And it's important to note that, as Halperin's definition suggests, these definitions of identity can be contested. They can change over time, and different groups within the organization or different subcomponents of the organization may have different views of what the organization should be doing and may compete over that. But we're going to assume that most of the time our government organizations do have some dominant sense of essence of what their overall mission and purpose is. Organizations are also defined by their structure. A key function of organizations, why we have them, is that they allow for specialization and for coordination. Through organizations, people can accomplish things that they couldn't do working independently. Tasks are split up both across and within organizations, allowing sub-organizations and individuals to specialize in different types of tasks. But this also requires delegation, which means that the leader, either of an organization or of the state as a whole, loses some degree of control in exchange for the benefits of specialization. This phenomenon of specialization and delegation is sometimes called factored problems and fractionated power. An organization structure determines how it divides up issues into different specialties and then coordinates or puts them back together. As with essence, an organization structure can evolve and change over time, both through intentional reorganizations, which we see from time to time, and less explicitly through changes in the reality of how things are done, which doesn't always exactly match the formal organizational chart. Finally, an organization is defined by its culture. Culture is a shared understanding within the organization about what behaviors and actions are valued and accepted by the organization. And it really shapes the way that the organization sees the world and thinks about its work and its role in the world. And this is true even when culture is implicit or not fully explicitly recognized by members of the organization. Sometimes people describe the relationship between members of an organization and its culture as similar to the relationship between fish and water. It's so pervasive that they don't even know they're in it. So that's what it means to think of an organization as an entity that has an identity in the sense of essence and even a personality in the sense of its culture. But what does it mean to think of foreign policy as outputs of what that organization does? An organization's mission, structure, and culture lead it to create processes and capabilities and to accumulate information and knowledge in the course of attempting to fulfill its mission in accordance with its culture. But organizations are completing dozens or hundreds or thousands of tasks all at the same time. So they need to operate efficiently. Dealing with each incoming issue or problem on an individual basis, applying the rational decision-making model that we discussed last time in the unitary state perspective, would take way too much time. The organization would get very little done. So instead of optimizing, organizations do what is called satisficing. That means that rather than considering all of the possible alternatives, all of the things they could do, and picking the very best one, the organization instead is just going to consider alternatives until it finds one that is good enough. And so in a satisficing process, two things are really important in determining what decision will be made. The first is the way that the organization searches for alternatives, the order that it goes through things, and also the way that it defines its standards of good enough, which will determine what it finally chooses. And both of these things are going to be shaped by the organization's mission, structure, and culture. Organizations basically institutionalize satisficing through the use of routines and standard operating procedures, which we often abbreviate as SOPs. Much of the everyday work of an organization is done by SOP. These often take an almost computer program-like form of if-then statements. If this happens, then I do that in response. Some of these are very simple. For example, if I work in a consulate, maybe, and someone arrives asking for a visa, I ask them for the appropriate form and documentation. And then if they give me that, then I give them the visa. Or in a different type of situation, if I, as an analyst, receive a report of type X, then I know I'm supposed to summarize that report and pass it on to person A in my organization. Now, of course, SOPs can also be much more complicated than these simple examples, but the idea is that they provide a structure and a regularized way of doing things that will be good enough on average. Most of the time, it will do a good enough job, it will get the job done. But it's important to note that there are situations where this can go wrong, where SOPs can produce very bad or occasionally very good, although we talk about those less frequently, outlier outcomes. This can happen in particular if a situation is categorized incorrectly and then as a result the wrong SOP is applied, or perhaps an SOP just produces unintended consequences in a particular situation. Still, overall, again, we're concerned about efficiency, about getting a lot done relatively well. SOPs are going to give us good performance on average, and they also allow for coordination within and across the organization as different parts of the organization know what to expect from the other parts. So this view of policy as organizational outputs, something happens, and as a result, the organization more or less automatically does something, helps us understand how things work well below the level of our senior decision makers that we often think of as making policy. The everyday workings of foreign policy organizations often don't rise to very senior levels. They only have so much time and attention that they can give to issues, so most things are resolved at much lower levels. But organizational process also describes one other role that organizations affect foreign policy, and that is that they shape the foreign policy decision-making environment. In addition to taking actions through SOPs, organizations also use SOPs to collect and to process information. Now, this leads to an important phenomenon called uncertainty absorption. which occurs when various specialized parts of the organization collect information and then they summarize the key findings of that information and pass it over or up within the organization. So as one analyst put it, what they're effectively doing is, quote, substituting inferences or judgments for facts, end quote. And so what we mean by uncertainty absorption is that at each level, uncertainty or sort of detail is being removed from the process. There are judgments made about what certain data means, and that judgment is passed up rather than the raw data itself, which again is the benefit of organizations. The more senior individuals don't have the time and attention to look at every detailed piece of information, so they rely on these summaries. But that does mean that, as we said, we're substituting analysis and judgments at various levels of the organization for the raw data. So the work that organizations do every day, both in processing information and in creating capabilities to do things, which can both be processes and actually creating sort of capital stuff that allows them to do things, do shape higher level decisions. So you can see here on the left, we have information and capabilities of the organizations, the things that it has processes and the capabilities to do. Those create the options that are available to senior decision makers for some of these decisions that do rise to the highest levels. But the organizational process perspective also helps us understand how these high-level decisions are then implemented. On the right side of your screen, you see that once senior decision makers actually set policy, they usually don't do it in a way that specifies every single action that's supposed to happen. There's a lot of room for the organizations to fill in the blanks and to decide what a policy actually means they should do. So all of this put together through the organizational process perspective helps us understand how foreign policy actions might not accord with the predictions of the unitary state perspective that we talked about last time. Government action might not be fully coordinated. Individual organizations may be creating outputs independently, not fully coordinated or sort of intended by any one decision-making entity. And also, at the same time, organizational context in terms of capabilities and information as it is summarized and passed up through the organizations can shape decisions in ways that senior decision makers don't always fully realize. So that was your brief introduction to the organizational process perspective. Thank you for watching. I will be back next time to talk about another perspective that focuses on the state societal level on organizations as actors, the bureaucratic politics perspective.